These are three films made between 1948 and 1950 that changed the way America saw itself, built a landscape out of real rock and myth, and forged the most celebrated director-actor partnership in Hollywood history. This is the story of John Ford's Cavalry Trilogy, Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and Rio Grande, the men, the land, the nation, and the remarkable chain of accidents and decisions and friendships that made them possible. Three films, one director, one star, one valley in the desert that became the visual soul of the American West, and behind all of it, a friendship between two stubborn, brilliant, difficult men, one Irish-born, one Iowa-raised, who between them defined what it meant to be American on a movie screen. By the time the last frame of Rio Grande rolled through a projector in November of 1950, Ford had reshaped American cinema in ways that are still being felt today. Wayne had climbed to the #1 box office position in the country, and Monument Valley, that soaring sacred landscape on the Utah-Arizona border, had been burned permanently into the collective imagination of the entire Western world. None of it was planned. Ford himself called these films potboilers, said he made them primarily for money, and never once referred to them as a trilogy, because in his mind they weren't one. The label came from critics years later, trying to make sense of something that happened almost by accident, shaped as much by commercial pressure and personal friendship as by any artistic vision. And yet these accidental potboilers contain some of the most breathtaking images in American film history. They gave us John Wayne's finest performance. They introduced the world to a place so spectacular and so otherworldly that audiences assumed it had been constructed on a studio backlot. It hadn't. This is the full story. The world before the trilogy. To understand what the Cavalry Trilogy meant, why it hit audiences the way it did, why it has endured for more than 70 years, and why it still moves people today, you need to understand the world it arrived into. 1948. World War II had been over for less than 3 years. 16 million American men had served in uniform. Hundreds of thousands had not come home, and those who had were rebuilding their lives, marrying, buying houses in the new suburbs, trying to stitch together civilian rhythms that the war had interrupted, and in many cases shattered. America in 1948 occupied a strange and uncomfortable position, the most powerful nation on earth, yes, and one of the most anxious. The Soviet Union had not yet detonated its first nuclear device, but the arms race was already reshaping foreign policy and national psychology with daily urgency. China was falling to Mao's Communist Party. The 38th parallel had divided Korea, setting the stage for a shooting war that would erupt just 2 years later. The Cold War carried no clear front line, no defined enemy in a uniform you could recognize, and no obvious end. And that specific kind of fear, formless and relentless, was something Americans in 1948 were still learning how to carry. Into that atmosphere of pride laced with dread, Ford brought 3 films about soldiers, not modern soldiers in modern wars, but cavalry soldiers, men in blue uniforms with yellow trim, riding horses across a landscape of almost supernatural grandeur. These were men who followed orders even when the orders were wrong, who buried their dead with ceremony and dignity, who held dances in the fort's parade ground and sang around campfires under skies full of stars. Men who served something larger than themselves, and who found in that service a community that made life bearable. The timing of all this was no accident. Ford had spent 4 years at actual war, and those years had shaped everything he believed about soldiers, service, and the institutions that men build to contain their better impulses. Wounded at Midway in 1942, present at the D-Day landings, a Navy captain who rose by war's end to the honorary rank of Rear Admiral, the real thing in other words, and when he came home, what he wanted to make were films that honored what the real thing looked like. Not war films exactly. He had already made They Were Expendable in 1945, a direct account of the Pacific Campaign. What drew him now was something older and more mythic. The frontier, the cavalry, those long lonely postings in the desert southwest where men held the line between civilization and everything that lay beyond it. He wanted to find in those older stories a mirror for what America was going through right now. Ford was also, always and in everything, a practical man. His independent production company Argosy Pictures, which he had formed with producer Merian C. had no studio safety net. Every film Argosy made either paid its way or threatened to sink the whole operation. Ford needed hits. The solution to all of these needs, artistic, commercial, and deeply personal, arrived in the form of a writer named James Warner Bellah, who published a series of short stories in the Saturday Evening Post between 1947 and 1948. The stories were set on the post-Civil War frontier, among the cavalry units who patrolled the Southwest. Full of action, conflict, and vivid detail, and also, according to Bellah's own son James Jr., the work of a fascist, a racist, and a world-class bigot. In their original form, the stories depicted Native Americans with casual brutality and contempt, presenting the cavalry as righteous conquerors. Argosy purchased each story for approximately $4,500, and then Ford set about transforming them into something else entirely, what he hired Frank S. Nugent to do. Nugent had been the lead film critic of the New York Times before moving to screenwriting, was to rewrite the dialogue, soften the racial framework, give the Native American characters dignity and complexity where Bellah had given them contempt, and make the army a vehicle for community and human connection rather than simple conquest. The resulting films bear only passing resemblance to Bellah's originals, and that gap between what Bellah wrote and what Ford put on screen is one of the most telling things about what the Cavalry Trilogy actually is. Ford took ugly raw material and turned it into something far more honest, not completely honest. That distinction matters, and we will address it, but meaningfully, substantially, unmistakably more honest than anything Hollywood had done before with this material. Before any of that could happen, though, two men had to find each other. The story of how they did is one of the great stories Hollywood has produced, and it begins not on a movie set, but with a prop boy who refused to stay knocked down when a director swept the feet out from under him on a sunny afternoon on the Fox Film Corporation lot. John Ford, the man behind the myth. John Martin Feeney came into the world on February 1, 1894, in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, the 10th of 11 children born to Irish immigrants, his father from Spittal, County Galway, his mother from the Aran Islands, those windswept limestone outcrops at the mouth of Galway Bay where the Irish language had survived for centuries. Growing up speaking some Gaelic, absorbing the Celtic sense of storytelling and landscape, and the bittersweet beauty of a life shaped by hardship and exile, young John Feeney carried those sensibilities with him for the rest of his life. The landscapes of his westerns, their vastness, the smallness of human figures moving through them, carry something almost Celtic in their feeling of the sublime. Ford was a mythmaker even about himself, constructing an alternate biography with the same deliberateness he brought to his films, claiming different birth years and different name origins until the invented version and the real one became tangled in ways that delighted him. The Dictionary of Irish Biography notes flatly that much of his autobiography was part of his own mythmaking. He switched professionally from Jack Ford to John Ford, with his 1923 film Cameo Kirby, and the new name suited the grand ambitions already forming. By 1913 he was in Hollywood, where his older brother Francis was already working as a director and actor, and by 1917, at 22 years old, Ford had directed his first feature, The Tornado. Over the following 5 decades, Ford directed approximately 140 films. The exact count depends on the source, with scholars ranging from 109 narrative features to well over 135 when short subjects and documentaries are included. But whatever the precise number, the volume and the quality together represent something the film world has never seen replicated. Within that body of work, Ford won 4 Academy Awards for Best Director, a record that has stood for more than 70 years, and that no director has come close to matching. The Informer won in 1935, The Grapes of Wrath in 1940, How Green Was My Valley in 1941, and The Quiet Man in 1952. Nominated 5 times, winning 4, his only loss came against Victor Fleming's Gone with the Wind for the 1939 ceremony, a result he accepted philosophically because there was no shame in it. Including his documentary wins for the Battle of Midway and December 7th, Ford collected 6 personal Oscars from 6 nominations. Spielberg has 2, Scorsese has 2, Wyler won 3, Ford won 4, and that 4th came 3 years after the last of the Cavalry Trilogy films. The numbers tell part of the story. What Ford actually did with his talent was something more lasting than winning awards. He invented a visual language for American cinema that shaped everything that came after, and that nobody, in more than 7 decades of trying, has fully equaled. His roots in the silent era meant he thought in pictures before he thought in words, and that gave his work a visual intelligence categorically different from directors who came to film from theater or literature. The doorway frame became his signature, shooting from darkness into light, so that the outside world sits within the frame of a doorway or window, creating a contained composition that gives even the largest landscape an intimate quality. It reaches its most celebrated expression in the final shot of The Searchers in 1956, where the door literally closes on John Wayne, as he is excluded from the domestic space he has helped to restore. The same device appears throughout the Cavalry Trilogy, in the contrast between the human warmth of enclosed fort spaces and the terrifying openness of the desert beyond them, repeated and varied until it becomes a visual argument about what civilization costs and what it's worth. Ford shot at approximately a 4-to-1 ratio when most Hollywood productions ran at 12-to-1 or higher. Arriving on set with the film already assembled in his head, he shot exactly what he planned to use, from exactly the angles he intended to use it, and left before anyone could talk him into more coverage. His editors had almost no choices to make. The film delivered to the cutting room was essentially the film that played in theaters. When it came to landscape, Ford's placement of the horizon was never arbitrary. High horizon, the sky compressed, the earth dominant, the riders dwarfed by rock. Low horizon, the sky open to its full scale, human figures small against it, free in their vulnerability. Years later, he explained the principle directly to a teenage Steven Spielberg by showing him 2 landscape photographs and asking, "When you know why the horizon goes at the top of the frame or the bottom of a frame, then you're a director." Spielberg carried that lesson for the rest of his career, recreating the conversation almost verbatim in The Fabelmans in 2022, with David Lynch playing Ford, a tribute about as explicit as one filmmaker has ever paid another. Ford's use of music throughout his work deserves particular attention because in the Cavalry Trilogy it functions as architecture rather than decoration. Certain songs carry emotional weight for an audience of veterans. Shall We Gather at the River at Funerals, Gary Owen as the 7th Cavalry's Regimental March, the Sons of the Pioneers performing around campfires in Rio Grande, and Ford used them with the precision of a composer. Ritual and ceremony served the same function. The morning bugle, the dress parade, the formal dance in the fort's parade ground. In Ford's conception, these weren't backdrop. They were the substance of what civilization was, the rituals through which a group of individuals became something that could endure. As a man, Ford was difficult, demanding and sometimes genuinely cruel in his working methods. The eye patch, the chewed handkerchief, the oblique instructions and the withering public put-downs. Henry Fonda, who appeared in some of Ford's finest films including Fort Apache, called him a son of a bitch who happens to be a genius, meaning it simultaneously as criticism and as the highest praise he knew how to give. Pat O'Brien, who acted for Ford multiple times, described the experience differently. Working for him is like being part of a ballet. He composes his shots like a master painter, a Rembrandt or Degas. Both descriptions were accurate, depending on which day you happen to be on set. Ford's wartime service deserves more than a passing mention because it shaped everything he made after. Joining the U.S. Naval Reserve as lieutenant commander on October 3, 1934, he reported for active duty in September of 1941 and headed the field photographic branch of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. In June of 1942, filming from the airfield control tower on Sand Island at Midway, shrapnel wounded him during the Japanese attack and earned him a Purple Heart. The documentary he built from that footage, The Battle of Midway, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary at the 1943 ceremony, and December 7 won the same award in the short subject category. Ford stood on ships watching D-Day unfold on June 6, 1944. He oversaw filming of the Nuremberg trials. He incorporated liberation footage from Dachau into the prosecution documentary Nazi concentration camps. By war's end, he held the rank of captain, eventually receiving the honorary rank of Rear Admiral, the title on his gravestone. All of that experience, the blood and the courage and the institutional loyalty and the civilian ceremonies of military life, fed directly into the Cavalry Trilogy. Ford came home from real war and made films about soldiers dancing with their wives in a desert fort because that was what the whole terrible thing had been worth fighting for. John Wayne. Marion Morrison, from Winterset. Marion Robert Morrison was born on May 26, 1907, in Winterset, Iowa. A big good-natured boy who grew up in Southern California and attended USC on a football scholarship, working summer jobs at Fox Film Corporation to earn extra money. The nickname Duke came from his childhood Airedale Terrier. Neighborhood children called the boy Little Duke and the dog Big Duke, and Wayne carried it for the rest of his life until it meant something very specific to American audiences, something solid and reliable and unshakable, like bedrock, like the land itself. Roughly 179 film and television productions filled a 50-year career stretching from 1926 to 1976, but the early years were far from glamorous. After his first starring role in the 1930 epic The Big Trail, a large-budget production shot in a new widescreen process that flopped when theaters couldn't afford to install the equipment, Wayne fell back into a decade of B-westerns and serials. He made more than 60 of them, pictures that played Saturday matinees in small towns and then disappeared. He was a fixture, a recognizable face, a reliable presence in pictures that nobody was analyzing for their artistic merit. Not a star yet, but Ford was watching, and Ford saw something the studios had missed. The story of Wayne's military non-service during World War II is one of the more complicated chapters in his biography, and it demands honest telling because it shaped him deeply and left marks that never fully healed. 34 years old on December 7, 1941, married with 4 children, Wayne qualified for a 3A deferment under Selective Service Regulations based on family dependency. This was legal and above board, and millions of American men with families received similar classifications. But the complications ran further. Republic Pictures President Herbert J. Yates had already lost Gene Autry to the Army Air Corps and was determined not to lose Wayne the same way, and Yates intervened with the Selective Service to secure additional deferments, eventually moving Wayne's classification to 2A, meaning essential civilian worker. National Archives records show Wayne made genuine attempts to enlist. An application to the OSS, Ford's outfit, received a positive response, but the letter apparently reached Wayne's estranged wife Josephine before it reached Wayne, and never got passed along. Wayne wrote directly to Ford himself, "Have you any suggestions on how I should get in? Can you get me assigned to your outfit? How about the Marines?" Nothing came of it, and while Ford was taking shrapnel at Midway, Wayne was on a soundstage, 13 films during the war years. The guilt of that, whether entirely deserved or not, shaped everything that came after. Wayne became one of Hollywood's most outspoken political conservatives and anti-communists, served as president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals beginning in 1948, and later directed the Green Berets in 1968, at the height of anti-Vietnam protest, partly because he felt personally obligated to support men who were doing what he had not done. The fierce patriotism he projected on screen, the passionate off-screen support for military action, a sustained lifelong attempt to be the soldier he hadn't been. Ford knew all of this, and for a time used it as a weapon, filming They Were Expendable in 1945 with a largely veteran cast that included Robert Montgomery, decorated at D-Day and in the North Atlantic. Ford stopped Wayne mid-take as he attempted a military salute, and snapped in front of the entire crew, "Duke, you can't manage a salute that at least looks like you've been in the service?" The taunting continued until Montgomery told Ford to stop, and yet the relationship between these two men was the most important professional relationship of either man's life, more important than any individual film, more enduring than any individual success or failure. Ford had rescued Wayne from B-movie obscurity with Stagecoach. Wayne had given Ford his greatest commercial successes with the Cavalry Trilogy and The Quiet Man. Each needed the other in ways that neither fully articulated and that both sometimes resented. Wayne described their bond in his unfinished autobiography as a very fine manly love, and in a letter written to Ford in 1961 he put it more plainly still, "You are my best friend, someone I have a blood kinship with, complicated, bruising, occasionally cruel, and absolutely irreplaceable." How Ford and Wayne found each other. The first meeting happened at the Fox Film Corporation lot in the mid to late 1920s, and it began, characteristically for Ford, with a physical challenge that could have gone badly and instead went beautifully. Wayne was working as an assistant property man connected to the studio through the informal network of USC football. His coach Howard Jones knew silent Western star Tom Mix, who knew the studio, and Wayne was there to earn summer money. Young, enormous, athletic, and slightly out of his depth in the machinery of a working film lot, he was exactly the kind of young man Ford liked to test. The famous first encounter has been told many ways, but the essential shape remains consistent. Ford swept Wayne's hand out from under his three-point football stance and sent him face first into the dirt. Wayne got up. He demanded a rematch. In the scuffle that followed, he accidentally kicked Ford hard enough to knock the director back on his heels. Ford wasn't angry. He was delighted. A big young man who didn't back down when knocked over, who fought back even against a superior, and who did it without malice or calculation. That was worth watching. From that afternoon, Ford kept a proprietary eye on Marion Morrison. Uncredited extra work in Mother Machree in 1928 came first, then Hangman's House the same year, then a speaking part in Salute in 1929, and another extra role in Men Without Women in 1930. Background work, atmosphere, a face in the crowd, but Ford was watching all of it. And then the big trail flopped, the decade of B-westerns began, and Ford continued watching from a distance while the studios continued missing what was right in front of them. The moment Ford had been waiting for arrived in 1938, during a cruise on his yacht the Ariner. The rights to a short story called Stagecoach sat in Argos' portfolio, and the studios had been turning it down for years. Westerns were B-pictures, they said, and nobody wanted a big-budget western. Finally, Walter Wanger agreed to finance it. On the Ariner, Ford teasingly asked Wayne to read the script and suggest some young actor for the lead role of the Ringo Kid, and then, after listening patiently to Wayne's suggestions, offered the part to Wayne himself. The studios resisted the casting. Ford fought for it, hard and without compromise. During filming, he was relentless. "Don't you know how to walk? You're as clumsy as a hippo. Stop slurring your dialogue. You look like a poached egg." Claire Trevor, who co-starred as Dallas, recalled years later that Ford was really tough on Wayne, but he took it like a man, and he learned 8 volumes about acting in that picture. Ford explained his method afterward with the bluntness he preferred. "I surrounded him with superb actors, and some of the glitter rubbed off on his shoulder." Stagecoach opened on March 2, 1939, and from that night forward, John Wayne was a star. Monument Valley, which Ford used for the film's exterior sequences, entered the American imagination for the first time, and the combination, once it happened, could not be undone. Even after Stagecoach, Ford didn't rush Wayne into further productions. The Grapes of Wrath in 1940, How Green Was My Valley in 1941, Prestige Pictures, literary adaptations made without Wayne. The war years separated them, complicated them, enriched them both in ways that took years to fully understand. By the time they arrived in Monument Valley in the summer of 1947 to start filming Fort Apache, they had known each other for nearly 20 years. Ford had directed Wayne in Stagecoach, The Long Voyage Home, and they were expendable. Wayne had made Ford godfather to 2 of his sons, Patrick and Ethan. They played cards together on the Eriner, drank together, argued ferociously about politics and films and personal choices, and reconciled just as ferociously. 24 Ford films, and 3 Ford-directed television appearances across 35 years. And within that entire collaboration, the 3 years of the Cavalry Trilogy represent the period when both men were at the height of their powers, the partnership running at maximum intensity, Ford's visual genius meeting Wayne's growing dramatic depth in ways that neither could have achieved separately. The Valley That Became America. Before the films themselves, we need to spend serious time with the place, because the Cavalry Trilogy is as much about Monument Valley as it is about any human being who appears within it. The landscape is not backdrop. Ford called it the real star, and he meant it literally. Monument Valley sits across the Utah-Arizona state line, entirely within the Navajo Nation, the largest Native American reservation in the United States, on land the Dene people have called home for generations beyond reliable counting. The Navajo name is Tsebian-Diskai, meaning Valley of the Rocks, and that name does almost nothing to prepare a first-time visitor for the actual experience of standing in it. The valley floor runs between 5,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level, and above that already elevated base rise the buttes, those enormous flat-topped towers of sandstone that define the valley's character, the way a cathedral's spire defines a medieval skyline. The largest formations top 1,000 feet above the valley floor, which means that standing at their base you are looking up at something roughly the height of the Eiffel Tower, made of ancient rock and utterly alone in the landscape with no geological context nearby to explain it. They simply rise, vertical and magnificent, from an essentially flat plain. Jurassic period sandstone approximately 160 million years old, laid down when the area was a vast desert of enormous wind-blown dunes, was compressed into stone, tilted slightly by geological forces, and then carved over tens of millions of years into the formations visible today. The vivid red and orange coloration that makes the valley so visually arresting comes from iron oxide in the weathered siltstone, essentially rust, while the darker blue-gray formations get their color from manganese oxide. That contrast between red and blue-gray, especially in the changing light of morning and late afternoon, produces one of the most extraordinary natural color effects on Earth. The West and East Mitten Buttes are the most photographed formations in the valley, each resembling an enormous mitten, a thumb of rock separated from a wider palm by a narrow gap. Merrick Butte rises nearby. Sentinel Mesa commands a long sweeping view of the valley floor. Castle Rock, Totem Pole, the Three Sisters, each has its name, its character, its specific quality of light at different hours of the day. The Navajo traditionally regarded the mittens as the hands of a deity, and this was sacred ground. Harry Goulding arrived in the valley around 1923 or 25, a sheep trader turned Indian trader who built a trading post with his wife Leon, known to everyone as Mike, and made his life among the Navajo communities there, learning the language, trading goods, becoming part of the place's fabric. What he had was patience and an eye for the spectacular, and the Depression gave him the occasion to act on both. Watching his Navajo neighbors struggle, the average annual income for a Navajo family at the time running approximately $82, Goulding heard that a Hollywood studio was searching for a Western location. He gathered his last approximately $60, packed bedrolls for himself and Mike, loaded up a collection of landscape photographs taken by the photographer Joseph Munch, and drove to Los Angeles. At United Artists Studios, the front desk had no interest in him. Goulding reportedly threatened to sleep in the lobby until someone looked at the photographs. That is either literally true, or the kind of story that ought to be true, And the result was the same either way. An executive spotted the Munch photographs, spread across a desk, went and got John Ford, and Ford sent Golding home to Monument Valley with a check for $5,000 and orders to prepare for a film crew. Stagecoach went into production in 1938, released in March of 1939, and from that moment forward, the valley belonged to Ford in the way that a painter's signature belongs to a painting. Golding's trading post became the base camp for all 7 of his Monument Valley productions. Stagecoach in 1939, My Darling Clementine in 46, Fort Apache in 48, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon in 49, The Searchers in 56, Sergeant Rutledge in 60, and Cheyenne Autumn in 64. The prominence overlook within the tribal park now carries the name John Ford Point in his honor. Other filmmakers avoided the valley for decades after, treating it as Ford's territory and knowing they couldn't survive the comparison. Sergio Leone was the one who finally broke the pattern, using Monument Valley in Once Upon a Time in the West in 1968, 29 years after Stagecoach, and doing so as an explicit act of tribute and dialogue, placing his own vision in conversation with Ford's rather than trying to ignore it. Ford talked about the valley with a reverence unusual for a man who deflected most emotional questions with a quip. In the March 1964 issue of Cosmopolitan, he said, "I think you can say that the real star of my westerns has always been the land. My favorite location is Monument Valley. It has rivers, mountains, plains, desert. I feel at peace there. I consider this the most complete, beautiful, and peaceful place on earth." The biographer Scott Amon put it from the outside looking in. "There are certain places in the world that seem like special effects. They don't seem real. And the first time you come here you see it through John Ford's eyes." That is how completely Ford had claimed this landscape, made it his, and in making it his made it everyone's. The Navajo Nation. This part of the story demands careful and honest telling, because it is both genuinely moving and genuinely complicated, and doing right by it means holding both of those things at the same time. Before Monument Valley was Ford country, before it was a celebrated film location, before it was the visual shorthand for the American West carried in the minds of billions of people who have never set foot in Utah or Arizona, it was home. Tsebi Ndoizgai, sacred ground. The place where Navajo families had lived for generations, where Navajo gods and ancestral spirits were believed to dwell, where a great and resilient people had their deepest roots. Ford knew this, and his response to it was considerably more complex and more human than the narrative of simple Hollywood exploitation that is sometimes applied to him. For Stagecoach alone, his first Monument Valley production, filmed in 1938, Navajo workers earned approximately $48,000 in total wages, $48,000 at a time when the average annual Navajo family income ran approximately $82. Ford's single production put the equivalent of nearly 600 years of average Navajo income into the local economy. Pay rates for extras ran from $5 to $20 per day, with mounted extras who supplied their own horses earning more. A core group of approximately 50 Navajo served as Ford's regular workers across multiple productions, men who knew the landscape intimately and could be counted on to show up and do the work well. John Stanley organized and interpreted, indispensable given that most crew members spoke no Navajo. Bob Many Mules, Harry Blackhorse, Billy Yellow, and others formed a stable foundation that persisted across years of productions. By the time of The Searchers in 1956, Ford employed approximately 5,000 Dene people in and around the production. The Smithsonian has documented that each of his 7 Monument Valley films pumped tens of thousands of dollars into the local economy, and the aggregate economic impact across 25 years of production was transformative for the region. The personal relationship went beyond employment. During the filming of The Searchers in 1955, the Navajo Nation made Ford an honorary member and gave him the name Natani Nez, Tall Leader. The Navajo called him One Eye, because of the eye patch, a nickname he accepted with apparent good humor. Ford learned some Navajo over the years and made efforts to communicate directly with community members rather than relying entirely on interpreters. The winter of 1948-49 provides perhaps the most revealing glimpse of that personal connection. Snow cut off Navajo families in the valley from food and basic supplies. The winter between Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and Ford arranged for military airdrops of food and provisions to the stranded communities. Not a publicly announced charitable gesture, not something he took credit for. The biographer Scott Amon found it in the course of research, years after Ford was gone. Ford did it and didn't publicize it. Ford put his position on Native Americans plainly in interviews. "My sympathy is all with the Indians. Who better than an Irishman could understand the Indians, while still being stirred by the tales of the U.S. cavalry? We were on both sides of the epic." And on the practical dimension he was equally direct. A lot of people say nice things about Indians, but don't give them work. More humbly, I give them work. Billy Yellow, a DNA medicine man and one of Ford's most trusted long-serving collaborators, described the director as a nice guy, easy to work with, and a good leader. An assessment from someone with no particular reason to be generous. And yet the complications are real and cannot be waved away. In the Cavalry Trilogy, and across virtually all of Ford's westerns, Navajo extras regularly played Apache, Comanche, and other tribal groups that were not their own. They appeared on screen as generic Indians, identifiable by costume and war paint, rather than by any authentic cultural specificity. The specific identity of the Navajo Nation, their language, their traditions, their particular history in that particular landscape, remained essentially invisible in the films. And when Navajo extras were directed to speak authentic Indian dialogue, what actually happened is now documented history. Since the filmmakers spoke no Navajo, the extras frequently spoke their own language and said whatever they felt like saying. Historian Robert McPherson has documented that at Navajo screenings of these films, audiences sat quietly through the dramatic sequences and then burst into laughter when their friends and family members appeared on screen, spouting dialogue that had nothing to do with the scene. As McPherson writes, for Navajo viewers it was like watching home movies, but home movies in which the humor was entirely private, unavailable to the Hollywood audiences who took the scene seriously. The scholarly reassessment of Ford's legacy in this regard continues. Joseph McBride, whose biography Searching for John Ford is the most comprehensive account of the director's life, argues that Ford's portrayals spanned a range, and that his genuine community ties and economic impact cannot fairly be dismissed. Other scholars argue with equal validity that Ford's films transformed sacred Navajo ground into a mythic space for American conquest mythology, in which the Navajo appeared primarily as supporting characters in the narrative of their own dispossession. Both arguments are correct, and that is the honest position. Ford's own evolution reflects a growing awareness. Fort Apache in 1948 positioned Native Americans with more sympathy than any previous Hollywood Western. Cheyenne Autumn in 1964 was a sincere, deeply flawed attempt to tell the story from the Native American perspective. The distance between Stagecoach's attacking Indians and Cheyenne Autumn's attempted corrective is real, and it was covered on purpose. As a measure of how far American cinema has come and how far it still has to go, the Navajo Nation signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the state of Utah in March of 2026, formalizing filmmaking on Navajoland and advancing authentic indigenous representation in contemporary productions. That agreement, compared to the era when Navajo extras played every tribe but their own, measures something that matters. Fort Apache. Released in March of 1948, Fort Apache was produced by Argosy Pictures and distributed by RKO Radio Pictures, with a proposed budget of $2.8 million that Ford brought in approximately $700,000 under budget, a final cost of roughly $2.1 million. On a production of this scale and ambition, that discipline was not the result of luck. Ford arrived knowing exactly what he needed to shoot, and he left before anyone could talk him into anything extra. The cast was exceptional even by the extraordinary standards of Ford's company. John Wayne played Captain Kirby York, Y-O-R-K, without an E at the end, a detail we will return to. Henry Fonda took the role of Lieutenant Colonel Owen Thursday, a recently demoted officer driven by ambition and contempt for virtually everyone around him, from his fellow officers to the Apache he is tasked with managing. Shirley Temple, the child star of the 1930s, now 20 years old, played Thursday's daughter Philadelphia. Victor McLaglen brought comic depth to Sergeant Festus Mulcahy. Ward Bond, who appeared in 24 Ford films over his career, was Sergeant Major O'Rourke. Pedro Armendariz played Sergeant Beaufort with quiet authority. George O'Brien, Ford's leading man from the silent era, appeared as Captain Collingwood. Anna Lee played Emily Collingwood with warmth and intelligence, and Miguel Inclán brought extraordinary gravity to the role of Cochise, the Apache leader. Wayne, Fonda, and Temple each received $100,000. McLaglen earned $75,000. Location shooting in Monument Valley ran from late July of 1947 through August 11, 25 days of exterior work. Production then shifted to Corriganville Movie Ranch in Simi Valley, California, for the fort exterior. The entire film wrapped in October of 1947, 25 days ahead of its planned schedule. The cinematographer Archie Stout made a technical decision that fundamentally shapes how Fort Apache looks 75 years later, shooting the exteriors on black and white infrared film stock. Infrared renders blue sky dramatically darker, makes white clouds glow with almost supernatural brilliance, and creates day-for-night effects of exceptional depth. The buttes of Monument Valley emerge from skies of impossible contrast. cavalry riders casting hard shadows across a landscape that seems to belong to a different and more primal world. Fort Apache used more infrared stock than any previous Hollywood production, and the resulting photography carries a sculptural power that no conventional stock could have achieved. William Clothier handled uncredited second unit work, gathering additional material that Ford wove into the film's sweeping landscape passages. Bellah's massacre served as the source material, drawing explicitly on both the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Fetterman Fight of 1866, in which Captain William Fetterman led 81 soldiers into an ambush, after boasting that with 80 men he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation. Fort Apache's structural parallel is direct. Thursday is Custer, brilliant in a narrow technical sense, arrogant to the point of pathology, convinced of his own destiny, contemptuous of an enemy he underestimates. York is the officer who sees clearly, understands the Apache, recognizes that Thursday's arrogance will get everyone killed, and cannot stop it. The film's handling of the Apache was unprecedented for a Hollywood Western of the era. Cochise appears as a man of clear dignity and moral standing, a leader who agreed to terms that a corrupt Indian agent then violated, and who went to war because of legitimate grievance rather than bloodlust. The conversation between York and Cochise, in which York acknowledges the justice of Cochise's position while trying to prevent a massacre, carries a quality of genuine respect between equals that simply hadn't existed in the genre before 1948. And the villain of the piece is not Cochise. The villain is Thursday, and behind him the corrupt agent Silas Meacham. The cavalry's enemy is arrogance, dishonesty, and the institutional machinery that promotes men like Thursday and protects men like Meacham. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times recognized immediately what Ford had done, praising the film for presenting a new and maturing viewpoint in which it is not the heathen Indian who is the heavy of the piece. Something genuinely new was happening in American cinema, and Crowther understood it. What happens after Thursday's destruction is the film's most extraordinary achievement. York, now promoted, commanding the regiment, faces a group of journalists who want the heroic version of Thursday's last stand, and York gives it to them. He upholds Thursday's memory. He says Thursday was a great soldier, a hero, standing in front of a large painted portrait of Thursday on horseback, romantic and idealized and entirely false to the man York actually knew. He honors the myth that Thursday created for himself. 14 years before Print the Legend became the most famous line in Ford's filmography, in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962, the idea lived here in Fort Apache in 1948. What do we owe to the legends that hold communities together? What is the moral cost of maintaining a useful lie? The regiment, the nation, the shared story that binds people to each other, is the institution worth the dishonesty required to protect it? Ford dramatized the complexity with enough visual and emotional force that audiences felt the full weight of the dilemma without being told what to conclude. Fort Apache earned $3 million in U.S. domestic rentals and recorded a profit of $445,000, according to RKO's financial records. Decades later, critic Dave Kerr called it one of the great achievements of classical American cinema, and on the current Rotten Tomatoes aggregator, the film holds a perfect 100% score from 21 reviews. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, released to wide U.S. audiences on October 22, 1949, with a premiere in Kansas City on July 26. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon represents Ford at the absolute peak of his powers, the full ambition of the trilogy made visible, and John Wayne giving what many critics and historians consider the finest performance of his remarkable career. Argosy Pictures produced and RKO distributed. The budget ran approximately $1.6 million. Principal photography covered October 28 through November 27 of 1948, a 31-day shoot, completed ahead of schedule and under budget, 31 days in Monument Valley in late October and November, in the light that makes the red rock turn almost purple at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, to produce one of the most visually beautiful films the American cinema has ever made. The efficiency of it is almost incomprehensible. The cast built on and deepened what Fort Apache had established. Wayne starred as Captain Nathan Brittles, a man in the last days of a military career and the last chapter of a life. Joanne Drew played Olivia Dandridge, whose presence at the fort creates romantic competition between two junior officers, John Agar and Harry Carey Jr., both of them fumbling toward her with appropriate charm. Ben Johnson appeared as Sergeant Tyree, a role that showcased his extraordinary horsemanship in ways that remain among the most spectacular riding sequences ever put on film. Victor McLaglen returned as First Sergeant Quincannon, older and broader and even more richly comic than his Fort Apache incarnation. Mildred Natwick played the Major's wife Abby Allshard with a warm and knowing humor that gives the film much of its domestic texture. George O'Brien was Major Allshard. Chief John Bigtree played the aging Cheyenne chief Pony That Walks. And Francis Ford, the director's older brother, the man who had given John his start in Hollywood, appeared as the fort's barman, connecting the film to the deepest layers of the Ford family story. Source material came from Bellah's The Big Hunt, published December 6, 1947, and War Party, published June 19, 1948. Nugent rewrote them in collaboration with Lawrence Stallings, softening the racial framework and adding the emotional textures that give the film its particular quality of elegiac tenderness. Brittles visiting his wife's grave, speaking to her headstone as though she can hear him. The midnight negotiation with Pony That Walks. The visual achievement of She Wore a Yellow Ribbon demands extended discussion, because it is the most extraordinary aspect of the film and deserves more than a passing mention. Shot in 3-strip Technicolor, only Ford's second color film, with cinematographer Winton C. Hoch, who brought to the project a deep understanding of color theory and of Technicolor's specific capabilities and limitations. Before a single frame of film ran through a camera, Ford and Hoch made a decision that shaped everything. They would model the visual palette of the entire film on the paintings and sculptures of Frederick Remington. Remington, who died in 1909, was the greatest visual chronicler of the American West in the late 19th century. His bronze sculptures of cavalry troopers leaning into wind, his oil paintings of soldiers crossing rivers in failing light, his vast western skies and the small human figures moving beneath them, these were the defining images of the era Ford was recreating. Ford had loved them since childhood. Bringing them to life in Technicolor was the ambition. What Hoch achieved was extraordinary. The dirty blue of cavalry uniforms set against golden ochre valley floor, cumulus clouds building over the Mitten Buttes in late afternoon, their brilliant white shifting to gray and purple as storms approached. The dying light of Monument Valley in late October, that last burning hour when red rock turns to orange and then to almost purple and the sky shifts from blue to a deep bruised amber. Color in Yellow Ribbon is not decoration, it's content. And then there is the thunderstorm sequence, the single most celebrated passage in the entire trilogy and one of the most celebrated in all of Ford's work. A real storm rolled into Monument Valley during filming. The standard account, repeated in most film histories, holds that Ford ordered Hoch to keep shooting, that Hoch protested vigorously about insufficient light and the danger of attracting lightning with camera equipment, and then filed a formal complaint with the American Society of Cinematographers. But Harry Carey Jr., who was on set throughout the entire production, remembered something more collegial. Hoch said to Ford, "It's awfully dark, Jack. I'll shoot it. I just can't promise anything." And Ford replied, "Winnie, open her up and let's go for it. If it doesn't turn out, I'll take the rap." Whatever the exact conversation, lightning cracked over the Mitten Buttes, the cavalry rode through sheets of rain, and the Technicolor registered the storm's colors, the purple-gray of clouds, the strange yellow-green light that precedes heavy rain, the darkness and electricity of the moment, in a way that black and white could never have captured. The result looked simultaneously like a Remington painting and an actual storm, because it was both. Winton C. Hoch won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography, Color, at the 22nd Academy Awards in 1950. That Oscar remains the only one won by any film in the entire Cavalry Trilogy. Now we must talk at length about the performance at the film's center, because it represents the other great miracle of Yellow Ribbon. Nathan Brittles is Wayne as he had never been seen before, and would rarely be seen again. Brittles is not York, not the capable, active soldier in the prime of his powers. Brittles is aging, days away from mandatory retirement after decades of service, and he has outlived his wife. On a regular basis he visits her grave, kneeling in the dirt beside a simple wooden marker, reading her his official orders, asking her permission for decisions he has already made, talking to her as though she can hear him. He has given everything to an institution, and now he must face what remains when the institution no longer needs him. Wayne was 42 years old when he played this role, wearing subtle aging makeup to suggest a man in his 60s, and in Brittles he found something he had never quite accessed before, a quietness, a weariness, a willingness to be still when stillness was what the scene required. Ford had initially resisted casting Wayne. Watching Howard Hawks' Red River, which Wayne made for Hawks in 1948, changed Ford's mind. Red River revealed a dramatic depth in Wayne, particularly in sequences where his character becomes frightening and morally compromised, that Ford had not previously recognized or utilized. According to various accounts, though the biographer Michael F. Blake calls some of the more colorful versions Ford Blarney, Ford's reaction was, "I didn't know the big son of a bitch could act." Wayne himself reflected on the performance in a 1969 interview with Roger Ebert. "Nobody remembers Yellow Ribbon," he said, "where I was 35 playing a man of 65. The numbers were off. He was closer to 42 during filming, but the sentiment is accurate in the way that matters. His Academy Award nomination that year, he believed, should have been for Yellow Ribbon rather than for Sands of Iwo Jima, the more conventionally heroic war picture that actually earned him the nomination. $2.7 million in U.S. domestic rentals, a 92% score on Rotten Tomatoes, an 87 on Metacritic. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times calling it a dilly of a cavalry picture. Yee-ho! A response that managed to be both enthusiastic and slightly underdressed for what Ford had actually made. By any serious measure, a masterwork. If you love classic westerns, the kind with breathtaking landscape, genuine emotion, and filmmaking that holds up after 75 years, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell so you never miss one. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here every single week. The Ford Stock Company. Something made all three of these films possible and gave them a quality no other production system could have replicated: the John Ford Stock Company. Not casts assembled by studio casting departments meeting each other for the first time on the first day of production, but the same group of actors, technicians, and crew members, film after film, decade after decade, until the ensemble shorthand they developed became as natural as breathing. Ford called it the unit. It functioned like a military unit, or like a large, occasionally fractious, intensely loyal family, where everyone knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, and exactly how far to push without going too far. Jack Pennick appeared in 41 Ford films over his career. Ward Bond showed up in 24. Victor McLaglen aged from picture to picture in a way that gave his recurring characters a biographical continuity no single film could have created. Harry Carey Jr., son of the great silent Western star Harry Carey Sr., who had worked closely with Ford in the early years, appeared in all three Cavalry Trilogy films, as did Ben Johnson, Anna Lee, and Mildred Natwick. George O'Brien, who had been Ford's leading man in the 1920s, played the Major in Yellow Ribbon, and Francis Ford, the director's own older brother, appeared as the fort's barman in Yellow Ribbon, a small role connecting the film to the deepest layers of the Ford family history. The consequences for what ends up on screen cannot be overstated. When you watch a Ford Western, you believe these people know each other because they do. The actor playing the sergeant has worked beside the actor playing the captain in 4 previous films over 10 years. They have eaten together, played cards together, argued about baseball and politics and women, shared the specific experience of working for a director who was demanding and brilliant and occasionally terrifying. The subtle exchanges, the knowing glances, the physical ease with which these actors inhabit shared space, none of that comes from technique, it comes from memory. Ford's nightly poker games on location were the social mechanism holding the unit together. On the Yellow Ribbon location in late October and November of 1948, no town nearby, no entertainment available beyond what the company created for itself, the poker table in the evenings was where the social contract was renewed. Ford always had to win. Not a stated rule, simply understood, the way many things in Ford's company were understood by osmosis and example. Wayne attended every game, Wayne lost every hand, Wayne showed up the next morning at full professional capacity. Harry Carey Jr. documented this in his memoir Company of Heroes with affectionate exasperation. Here's a man who's carrying the whole picture on his shoulders, who has to know his lines perfectly, never miss his mark, and play cards every night and lose. The creative atmosphere this generated, trust, familiarity, shared hardship, mild resentment, and genuine affection braided together, comes through in every frame of the trilogy. The cavalry soldiers in Fort Apache feel like people who have buried their friends together over years of shared service. The troopers in Yellow Ribbon feel like men whose lives depend on each other in ways that have created bonds stronger than friendship. The unit in Rio Grande feels like a community with its own private language developed over long years of shared duty. Ben Johnson deserves particular mention. Not primarily an actor when Ford found him, he was one of the finest horsemen in the American Southwest, a rodeo competitor and stuntman who had grown up on horseback. Johnson brought to both Yellow Ribbon and Rio Grande a physical command of horses that was simply unavailable among trained actors. Ford designed sequences around what Johnson could actually do rather than what a stuntman could approximate, and the results remain among the most spectacular horsemanship sequences in the entire Western genre. Rio Grande. The backstory behind Rio Grande is, in some ways, as interesting as anything that appears on screen, because Rio Grande was not made out of artistic ambition or personal vision. Rio Grande was made because of a deal. By 1950, 2 enormously successful Cavalry Pictures under the Argosy RKO arrangement had established Ford's company and lifted Wayne to the top of the box office. Ford had also been trying for years, with mounting frustration, to bring a passion project to the screen, The Quiet Man, set in Ireland, drawn from his deepest personal mythology. A story about an Irish-American boxer returning to his family's village in the west of Ireland to rebuild his life and find a wife in a landscape that was Ford's ancestral homeland. The Quiet Man had everything Ford cared about most: Ireland, community, ritual, landscape, the comedy and tragedy of two people finding each other across a gulf of pride and misunderstanding. Herbert J. Yates, president of Republic Pictures, read the script and delivered his verdict: weak and of little general interest. Potentially reconsidering, but only if Ford first delivered a commercially proven Western with bankable stars. Rio Grande, with Wayne and a new actress named Maureen O'Hara, in exchange for Yates financing The Quiet Man. Ford's son Patrick confirmed the nature of the arrangement in later interviews, noting plainly, "Duke didn't really want to make it, it was just a job." Released on November 15, 1950, produced by Argosy and distributed by Republic. Ford's first film for Republic, Rio Grande, grossed $2.25 million in domestic rentals and won nothing at the Academy Awards. The Quiet Man, which Yates had called of little general interest, grossed $3.8 million in its first year alone and won Ford his record fourth Best Director Oscar. That is one of the most satisfying ironies in Hollywood history. The cast brought back the core of the stock company, with significant additions. Wayne played Lieutenant Colonel Kirby York, Yorke now, with the E Ford added deliberately as a quiet signal that this is the same man from Fort Apache, now promoted and in command of his own regiment. Maureen O'Hara appeared as his estranged wife Kathleen, making her first appearance alongside Wayne in what became one of the great screen pairings in Hollywood history. 5 films together, their chemistry evident immediately. She was, if anything, his physical and temperamental equal on screen, tall, red-haired, fierce, unwilling to be dominated, and capable of matching him in every scene. Claude Jarman Jr. played their son Trooper Jefferson York, whose enlistment in his father's regiment without telling either parent has reunited two people separated for years and uncertain whether they want to be in the same room. Ben Johnson returned as Trooper Tyree, carrying the same athletic grace and natural authority from Yellow Ribbon. Harry Carey Jr. came back as Trooper Sandy Boone. Victor McLaglen appeared for the third time as Sergeant Major Quincannon. J. Carroll Naish played General Philip Sheridan, a real historical figure named explicitly, giving Rio Grande a more direct connection to actual history than either of the previous 2 films. The Sons of the Pioneers, a celebrated vocal group led by Ken Curtis, who would later become famous as Festus on Gunsmoke, appeared as the regimental singers, providing the film with a musical backbone that carries real emotional weight. Their campfire performances and formal ceremony songs give Rio Grande a quality almost of musical theater, with music functioning as dramatic content rather than background scoring, and an 11-year-old boy named Patrick Wayne, John Wayne's son, to whom Ford was godfather, made his film debut here. A brief appearance without dialogue. Ford gave the boy the opportunity quietly and without fanfare, a private act of generosity in a film whose central theme was the relationship between fathers and sons. The screenplay came from James Kevin McGinnis, not Frank S. Nugent, who had written both Fort Apache and Yellow Ribbon. McGinnis worked in closer sympathy with Bellah's original tone than Nugent had. And Rio Grande is a less nuanced film as a result, more conventional in its treatment of the cavalry's adversaries, more straightforwardly traditional in its moral framework. Here is where Rio Grande makes its most striking departure from the other 2 films. It was not shot in Monument Valley. After 2 films that had made the valley virtually synonymous with the Ford Western, Ford took his crew to Moab, Utah, and the spectacular canyon landscape around it, the George White Ranch, Professor Valley, Fisher Towers, Castle Valley, Onion Creek Narrows, and the gorges of Ida Gulch along the Colorado River. The crew arrived June 14, 1950. Filming began June 15, in extreme summer heat, producing 665 takes of 646 setups in 32 days. Ford also reused some wide-angle shots from Fort Apache to cut costs, characteristic of the man's practical approach to budgeting. The Moab Canyon landscape is beautiful in its own right, but different from Monument Valley, more enclosed, more intimate, less cosmically vast. That intimacy actually suits Rio Grande, which is the most personal of the 3 films, focused on the domestic and the emotional, rather than the mythic sweep of the earlier pictures. York is a man caught between duty and family, between the institution that shaped his entire adult life and the wife that institution separated him from. Kathleen's presence at the fort forces both of them to confront what the military life has cost their marriage, specifically a Civil War decision, years earlier, in which York burned the Shenandoah Valley plantation that was Kathleen's ancestral home, following General Sheridan's orders, and destroying the thing she loved most to serve the cause he had committed to. These weren't abstract themes for Ford's audience in 1950. Every family watching had lived through some version of this: the husband who came home from the Pacific different from the man who had left, the wife who had rebuilt her life around his absence and now had to rebuild it around his presence, the children who had grown up without fathers. The specific setting of the 1870s cavalry was not the same as post-war 1950, but the emotional territory was close enough. The critical reception on release was respectful but less enthusiastic than Fort Apache or Yellow Ribbon had warranted. The New York Times described the film as traveling a deeply rutted road, a polite way of acknowledging that this was the most conventional of the three. Most subsequent critics and historians have agreed, ranking Rio Grande third. The film earned $2.25 million in domestic rentals and recorded a net profit of $215,634 according to Republic's financial records. What Ford built on these sets? The Cavalry Trilogy was not only commercially successful and critically admired. Genuine innovation, technical, artistic, and in terms of the visual and emotional vocabulary it established for the American Western, runs through all three films. What Ford actually invented and refined across these productions deserves careful examination. The most immediately striking visual element is Ford's relationship with the horizon line, and it is worth exploring in depth. High horizon compresses the sky, makes the Earth dominant, dwarfs the riders beneath what feels like geological pressure. Low horizon opens the sky to its full scale, makes the human figures small against something magnificent, free even in their vulnerability. These choices in the Cavalry Trilogy are never arbitrary. Each one argues something specific about the relationship between the human figures and the landscape they occupy. Ford's doorway compositions create a consistent visual grammar throughout all three films. Enclosed interior spaces, the officer's mess, the commanding officer's quarters, the enlisted men's barracks are constantly contrasted with the vast open landscape visible through windows and doorways. Shooting from darkness into light, Ford makes every exterior shot carry a quality of revelation, as though the open landscape is always slightly surprising even to the people who live within sight of it daily. The use of ritual and ceremony throughout the trilogy is Ford's most direct expression of his belief that community is civilization's highest achievement. The cavalry fort in his conception is a complete social world with its own calendar and its own liturgy, the morning bugle calls that structure time, the formal dress parades, the enlisted men's dances in the parade ground where officers and wives waltz formally while soldiers watch from the periphery. In those dance sequences, the social hierarchy of rank dissolves momentarily, and the ceremony of courtship supersedes the ceremony of command. Ford once said, "Two of the most beautiful things in the world are a horse running and a couple waltzing." The Cavalry Trilogy contains both, repeatedly and magnificently. Neither is mere spectacle. Both are arguments about what makes life worth living. The approach to color in Yellow Ribbon specifically pioneered a way of thinking about film color as a dramatic instrument rather than a reproduction of visible reality. Hoch and Ford used Technicolor's specific capabilities to create a palette that changed meaningfully from scene to scene and hour to hour. Golden warmth of morning light carries optimism and beginning. The harsh bright light of midday carries exposure and clarity, the absence of comfortable shadow. The late afternoon light, what photographers call the golden hour, carries the emotional weight of ending, of time running out, of beauty inseparable from its own impermanence. For Captain Nathan Brittles, facing the end of his military career, that dying light of Monument Valley in late October carries an almost unbearable emotional charge. Ford and Hoch understood this and used it deliberately, making color itself a kind of language about time and loss. Ford's editing across all three films reflects his formation as a silent-era director who thought entirely in images before he thought in words. His cuts are motivated by movement or emotion, never by a need to provide the audience with a fresh angle. The shots run long enough for viewers to look around within the frame, to notice the background detail or the landscape element that a faster cut would eliminate. These films reward patient watching and continue to reveal new things across multiple viewings, precisely because there is always more in the frame than any single viewing can absorb. And then there are the horses. Nobody in the history of the American Western filmed horses the way Ford did. This is a specific and remarkable achievement that demands stating plainly. The cavalry rides in his films are among the most beautiful things the cinema has produced in any genre, not because of technical trickery or slow motion, but because Ford understood the relationship between a well-trained horse and a skilled rider in a specific landscape, and he knew how to compose that relationship within the frame so that it becomes simultaneously documentary and sublime. Ben Johnson's riding in Yellow Ribbon and Rio Grande is the supreme example, a rodeo competitor and working stuntman who possessed a physical command of horses unavailable among trained actors. Ford designed sequences around what Johnson could actually do, rather than what a stuntman could fake, and the results have not been equaled in the 75 years since. The mythology of the cavalry. The Cavalry Trilogy arrived at a specific historical moment, and understanding that moment is necessary to understanding both why the films hit their audiences so powerfully, and why they have remained compelling to audiences in entirely different circumstances. The real United States cavalry of the 1870s and 1880s was a complex institution performing a morally compromised mission, forcing native peoples from their ancestral lands onto reservations, suppressing resistance with military force, serving the expansion of American settlement into territories that already had inhabitants. The cavalry units portrayed so heroically in Ford's films were, historically, instruments of a process that destroyed cultures, broke communities, and inflicted suffering at enormous scale. Ford knew this history, and engaged with it more honestly than virtually any other Hollywood filmmaker of his era. Fort Apache, at its structural core, is a film about the consequences of contempt and arrogance. Thursday's disdain for the Apache leads directly to the destruction of his command, and the film makes clear that Thursday bears the moral weight of what happens. The Apache are in the right. That was not a conventional position for a Hollywood Western to take in 1948. But Ford was making myths, not documentaries, and the myth he was constructing, the cavalry, as a democratic community of men bound by duty, honor, and mutual loyalty, maintaining difficult and imperfect work on a dangerous frontier, was precisely the myth that post-war America needed in the years between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Korean War. All three films center on Civil War veterans, men from the Union and the Confederacy, serving together in the same unit, their sectional differences dissolved by the shared experience of service and sacrifice. The subtext is clear and deliberate. Americans may have different backgrounds, different histories, different wounds, but they come together when duty calls. The enemy to fear is not internal division but external threat. Graham Fuller, writing in the winter 2025 issue of Cineast magazine in a major reassessment, titled Fighting the Cold War in the American West, argues that the trilogy served another purpose by re-invoking the frontier myth during the Cold War as a historical metaphor for national unity, the dread of communism having intensified after the 38th parallel divided Korea in 1948 and the victory of Mao's Communist Party in 1949. The Korean War began in June of 1950, the same summer Ford was filming Rio Grande in the heat of the Moab Canyon country. An anonymous New York Times reviewer, writing about Rio Grande's cavalry colonel routing Apache raiders who crossed the Mexican border to escape pursuit, described York as routing the Reds. The language tells you everything about the specific cultural moment. What makes Ford's westerns more durable than political allegory is that they consistently acknowledge the cost of the mythology they build. Fort Apache's closing sequence, York upholding Thursday's legend while knowing its falsity, is not a celebration of American heroism. It's a meditation on institutional loyalty and its price. Yellow Ribbon's farewell, Brittle's riding out of the fort for the last time, the regiment presenting arms as he passes, is heartbreaking precisely because we understand what he is losing, not just a career, but the only community he has ever truly belonged to. Rio Grande's portrait of a marriage destroyed by the demands of service asks whether the institutions we sacrifice for are worth the personal costs they extract. These were not abstract questions in 1948, 49, and 50. Every man in Ford's primary audience, men, many of them veterans, many of them wrestling with exactly these questions in their own post-war lives, knew what it cost to subordinate personal life to institutional duty. The trilogy spoke to that experience with honesty and depth unusual for popular entertainment. The revisionist reassessment of Ford's mythology began in the 1960s and deepened through the 70s. Little Big Man in 1970 and Soldier Blue the same year depicted the cavalry as agents of genocide rather than builders of civilization, made in the context of Vietnam and the growing awareness that American military power could be used unjustly. But here's the thing. Ford's own work had already anticipated many of these critiques. Fort Apache in 1948 was already showing the cavalry's arrogance and its catastrophic consequences. Ford was not a simple propagandist for cavalry mythology. He was a complex mythmaker who was simultaneously building the myth and questioning it. The partnership at its deepest. 24 films over 35 years, and none of it was simple. None of it was comfortable, and none of it was anything other than the most important professional relationship of either man's life. Wayne made Ford godfather to two of his sons, Patrick and Ethan. Ford's yacht, the Arenner, was the gathering place for an inner circle of male friendship. Wayne, Ward Bond, Henry Fonda, and others, on long cruises to Mexico and the Pacific, where conversation was unguarded and the cards came out every evening. These men had all served something, Ford literally at war, Wayne in the more complicated sense of representing a version of American masculinity at a critical moment, and the bond between them had the quality of shared service. Ford's treatment of Wayne on set confounded everyone who witnessed it. The cruelty was sustained, deliberate, and almost pedagogically designed. Every humiliation, every public put-down, every unexpectedly difficult scene called without warning, all of it aimed at pushing Wayne past the comfort zone of his natural screen presence. Ford knew Wayne's limitation, the tendency to rely on physical authority and natural ease rather than reaching for genuine emotional depth. The only way past that limitation was to make Wayne uncomfortable enough that his defenses came down. Harry Carey Jr. watched this dynamic play out across 3 films in many years and wrote about it in his memoir Company of Heroes with both humor and genuine insight. The poker games, the required losing, the need to absorb whatever Ford delivered and show up the next morning at full capacity. It was a system, unusual and demanding, designed to make John Wayne the best version of himself. The evidence of whether it worked is right there on screen. 3 different performances, each better than the last. In Fort Apache, York is confident and capable, and conventionally heroic, but something has opened that wasn't there before, a watchful intelligence behind the physical authority. In Yellow Ribbon, something has opened completely. Brittles is vulnerable in ways Wayne had never been allowed to be, uncertain, grieving, gentle, facing the end of everything with quiet dignity, rather than fighting energy. In Rio Grande, York carries a complex emotional burden, regret, love, the weight of long consequences that required genuine dramatic range to carry. 3 characterizations, 1 director, 1 system, 1 result. Wayne's letters to Ford in these years carry a frankness that is moving in its directness. After seeing The Searchers in 1956, he wrote, "Dear Pappy, it's just a wonderful picture. You got great performances out of everyone. All I can say is thanks again, coach." The word coach is the key. Wayne thought of Ford the way a player thinks of the coach who made him, someone whose job was to make him better, whose harshness served improvement rather than cruelty, whose approval meant something precisely because it was so rarely given. In the 1961 letter he was more personal. "You are my best friend, someone I have a blood kinship with." Between the Irish immigrant's son from Maine and the Iowa boy from Winterset who became the symbol of American frontier masculinity, between the rear admiral who had bled at Midway and the actor who had felt guilty for not serving and channeled that guilt into 50 years of playing soldiers, Wayne visited Ford on his deathbed in the summer of 1973. In a 1976 interview with Roger Ebert, he recalled the moment with spare, unhurried emotion. "All right, Duke," he said finally, "I think I'll rest for a while. I went home, and that was Pappy Ford's last day." John Ford died on August 31, 1973 in Palm Desert, California, at the age of 79, interred at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979 in Los Angeles, at the age of 72. In the 6 years between those deaths, Wayne kept a framed signed portrait of Ford from 1947 in his home. He kept it there until the day he died. In a 1976 interview, Wayne found the right words for what Ford had meant to him professionally, simpler and more precise than anything a film critic has managed. "I think he would have been the finest painter in the country because he knew how to use his paint. He knew how to use his paint." The critics in the world. The critical reception to the Cavalry Trilogy in its own time was enthusiastic, but the full weight of what Ford had achieved, the depth of the moral thinking, the technical daring, the lasting cultural reach was not immediately clear. It took years, and in some cases decades, for the critical community to catch up. Fort Apache received Crowther's recognition of its moral complexity at the Times, but earned no Academy Award nominations. She wore a yellow ribbon, won Hoch's Oscar, and played well with audiences and most critics. Rio Grande was acknowledged as the most conventional of the 3. And then a generation of filmmakers grew up watching these films and went on to make their own, and the reassessment began. Orson Welles had watched Stagecoach, Ford's first Monument Valley picture, repeatedly before making Citizen Kane in 1941, studying Ford's compositional strategies with the intensity of a student determined to absorb every available lesson. Welles later put his position on record: "I prefer the old masters, by which I mean John Ford. John Ford and John Ford." 3 times, in case anyone missed the point. Martin Scorsese, who has done more than any other contemporary filmmaker to preserve and promote the history of American cinema, said, "He is the essence of classical American cinema. Any serious person making films today, whether they know it or not, is affected by Ford. The whether they know it or not is the crucial phrase. Ford's influence has become so fully absorbed into the visual language of cinema that filmmakers who have never consciously studied his work are shaped by it anyway, because the directors who taught them were shaped by Ford, and the directors who taught those directors were shaped by Ford, and so on back through the entire tradition. Akira Kurosawa, whose samurai epics of the 1950s and 60s influenced American cinema in ways that ran parallel to and sometimes intersected with Ford's own influence, said simply, "John Ford is really great. When I'm old, that's the kind of director I want to be." When asked whether he studied particular painters for his visual compositions, Kurosawa reportedly replied, "I studied John Ford. The Mitten Buttes and the feudal Japanese landscapes of Rashomon are separated by everything except the eye that knew how to place a rider against a sky." Ingmar Bergman described Ford as the best director in the world. From the Swedish master of psychological cinema to the Irish-American maker of cavalry westerns, common ground found in the primacy of the image, in the belief that cinema was fundamentally visual and that directors who forgot this were failing their medium. John Milius, whose historical knowledge of Hollywood's golden age is encyclopedic, said, "Ford had the best eye." The visuals of Ford's movies have never been surpassed by anybody, including Kurosawa and David Lean. That is not modest praise, and it is not casually offered. Most film historians would find it difficult to argue with. Steven Spielberg's debt to Ford is both the most publicly acknowledged and the most practically significant of any contemporary filmmaker. The horizon lesson Ford taught Spielberg as a teenager, showing him 2 landscape photographs and asking him to explain the placement, appears in the visual logic of virtually every film Spielberg has made since. The beaches of Saving Private Ryan, the open country of Schindler's List, the desert landscapes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, all reflect compositional principles that Ford taught. In 2022, Spielberg released The Fabelmans, his autobiographical film about growing up in cinema's shadow, and cast David Lynch as Ford, staging the horizon lesson as one of the film's climactic moments, a tribute as explicit as one filmmaker has ever paid another. Among the trilogy, Fort Apache is generally considered the most fully achieved and the most critically serious. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon is celebrated for its visual achievement and for Wayne's performance. Rio Grande, commercially successful in its time, ranks 3rd in most serious assessments. None of the 3 appear on the American Film Institute's lists of the greatest films. Ford is represented there by The Grapes of Wrath at number 21, and The Searchers at number 12 on the 2007 list. The Searchers appeared at number 15 in the Sight and Sound 2022 poll, and is now widely considered both the greatest Western and one of the most influential films in cinema history. None of that exists without the technical and emotional foundation Ford built in the Cavalry Trilogy. The most important scholarly contributions to understanding the trilogy include Joseph McBride's Searching for John Ford, Scott Iman's Print the Legend, Harry Carey Jr.'s memoir Company of Heroes, Gary Will's cultural study John Wayne's America, and most recently Michael F. Blake's The Cavalry Trilogy, published in 2024, the first book-length production history dedicated exclusively to all 3 films. Monument Valley today and the films on screen. Monument Valley continues to exist, undiminished in the desert of the Utah-Arizona border. The Navajo Nation continues to be its keeper. The Mitten Buttes rise above the valley floor exactly as they did when Harry Goulding spread Joseph Munch's photographs on a desk in the United Artists Lobby in 1938, and the light changes across the same surfaces in the same patterns, morning to noon to late afternoon to the blue dark of desert evenings. The landscape does not care about the films made within it, 160 million years old and indifferent to all of it. Within that geological permanence, the human story continues. Goulding's Lodge, expanded from the original trading post across decades of growth, operates today as a full resort and museum complex. The original trading post building has been preserved as the Goulding's Trading Post Museum, a window into the moment when a determined sheep trader with $60 and a box of photographs changed American cinema. The converted potato cellar that served as the exterior of Captain Brittle's quarters in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon is preserved as what the museum calls John Wayne's Cabin, the same dirt floor structure where the most beautiful cavalry picture ever made was partially staged. The Monument Valley Navajo Tribal Park draws more than 350,000 visitors annually, tourism generated by the valley's cinematic fame contributing significantly to the Navajo economy, a contribution that began with Ford's productions in the 1930s and has compounded across 8 decades. John Ford Point, the overlook named in the director's honor within the tribal park, offers the precise angle and the precise view that appears in dozens of Ford's Monument Valley shots. The wide valley floor, the Mitten Buttes rising in the middle distance, the sky above them. Standing there you see what his camera saw. For home viewing, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon was released on Blu-ray by Warner Archive in June of 2016, sourced directly from the original 3-strip Technicolor negatives. The quality received exceptional reviews, some calling it the best-looking Technicolor film I've ever seen on Blu-ray. Fort Apache and Rio Grande have been available in various DVD and Blu-ray formats, collected in John Wayne and John Ford box sets. Warner Archive began releasing Ultra HD Blu-ray versions of Ford's films in November of 2024, starting with The Searchers. The Navajo Nation's relationship with filmmaking in and around the valley continues to evolve in meaningful ways. In March of 2026, the nation signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the state of Utah to formalize filmmaking on Navajo land and advance the goal of authentic indigenous representation, specifically the representation of Navajo and other native peoples as themselves, in stories that honor their actual cultures and histories. That agreement marks a real shift from the era when Navajo extras played every tribe but their own, and from the era when sacred Diné ground was transformed without negotiation or credit into Ford country. The distance between that agreement and the 1940s is real, and it is not yet enough. What the trilogy meant. We began with Acclaim, 3 films made between 1948 and 1950 that changed the way America saw itself, built a landscape out of real rock and myth, and forged the most celebrated director-actor partnership in the history of Hollywood. After everything we have explored, the production histories, the technical innovations, the performances, the landscape, the Navajo community, the Cold War context, the decades of critical reassessment, we can assess that claim with the seriousness it deserves. The Cavalry Trilogy changed the way America saw itself, taking the mythology of the frontier, the cavalry soldier, the wilderness fort, the dangerous border between civilization and everything beyond it, and giving that mythology a visual and emotional language so vivid and so precisely rooted in the specific landscape of Monument Valley. Ford established the baseline against which every subsequent Western was measured, not just American Westerns. Sergio Leone's Italian-made spaghetti Westerns of the 1960s were in explicit conversation with Fort Apache and Yellow Ribbon. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch in 1969 was partly a furious argument with the traditions Ford had established. The revisionist Westerns of the 1970s and 80s, from Dances with Wolves to Unforgiven, were defined by their relationship to Ford's vision, which they either continued or reacted against but could not ignore. The trilogy built a landscape out of real rock and myth. Monument Valley, as Ford filmed it, is not a fictional place. Every formation, every shadow, every cloud is real, but it is also not simply a documentary record of a real location. It is a construction, an artistic vision, a specific selection and arrangement of real elements that creates something beyond what any of those elements could achieve alone. No subsequent filmmaker has photographed Monument Valley with anything approaching Ford's authority, not because the valley has changed, it hasn't, but because Ford's vision of it was an unrepeatable act of creative imagination that could only be made once, by that specific person, in those specific years, with that specific crew and cast and light. The trilogy forged the most celebrated director-actor partnership in the history of Hollywood. 24 films over 35 years, beginning with a prop boy knocked into the dirt and ending with a dying man's last words to the friend who had come to say goodbye. Conducted through cruelty and loyalty, and card games on the Araner, and letters that said, "You are my best friend, someone I have a blood kinship with." Expressed most fully, most completely, most beautifully in 3 years in Monument Valley and Moab, making 3 cavalry pictures that Ford called potboilers and that the world has recognized as considerably more than that. America in 1948 was a country that had just won a terrible war and was afraid of what came next. The trilogy gave Americans images of men who had endured, who had served, sacrificed, suffered and maintained their humanity under conditions of extreme difficulty. It gave them images of community, the enlisted men's dance, the morning bugle, the regiment presenting arms, the shared meal, the shared burial of the shared dead. It gave them images of a landscape so vast and so beautiful that it seemed to promise something: room to grow, room to fail, room to begin again. Were these images fully true? Were they entirely honest? Sometimes. The trilogy is more honest than most popular entertainment of its era, and less honest than the full historical record would require. It is a myth, deliberately, artistically, powerfully constructed, and myths are not the same as history, but myths are not lies either. They are the stories a culture tells about what it aspires to be. And the stories Ford told in these 3 films, about duty and loyalty, and community, and sacrifice, and the price of legend, and the cost of service, are stories that Americans have been grappling with for 75 years, and will be grappling with for generations to come. The cavalry fort of the 1870s became in Ford's films a kind of ideal republic, a place where men of different backgrounds served together under a common obligation, bound not by ideology, but by shared work and shared risk, and the daily practice of showing up. That ideal was partly fictional in 1948, and it is partly fictional today. But it is a good ideal. It is worth the aspiration. Ford believed in it. He put it on screen with a conviction and a visual beauty that make it impossible not to be moved even now, with full awareness of everything the myth leaves out. Wayne once said of Ford, "I think he would have been the finest painter in the country because he knew how to use his paint." He was right. And the 3 films of the Cavalry Trilogy, Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Rio Grande, are among the finest paintings American cinema has produced. The legacy in full. Each of the 3 films deserves a final accounting, because each one stands as its own distinct achievement within the trilogy's shared framework. Fort Apache, released in March of 1948, is the most intellectually ambitious of the 3, and the most directly engaged with the moral complexity of American mythology. Thursday's arrogance kills innocent men. The Apache occupy the moral high ground, and York, knowing the truth, upholds the legend anyway. That choice, deliberate and morally compromised and institutionally loyal, anticipates the print the legend conclusion of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance by 14 years, and represents one of the most sophisticated moments in American popular cinema. Shot in black and white infrared photography by Archie Stout, completed 25 days ahead of schedule at approximately $2.1 million against a proposed budget of $2.8 million. The film earned $3 million in domestic rentals and now holds a perfect 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, released October 22, 1949, is the most visually beautiful of the 3 films, the supreme expression of Ford and Hoch's Remington-inspired Technicolor vision, and contains what many serious historians and critics consider John Wayne's finest dramatic performance. The thunderstorm sequence remains one of the great set pieces of the Western genre. Hoch's Academy Award for Best Cinematography Color, the only Oscar won by any of the 3 Cavalry Trilogy films, honored an achievement that 75 years of subsequent filmmaking has not surpassed. Shot in 31 days at approximately $1.6 million, the film earned $2.7 million in domestic rentals and holds a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. Rio Grande, released November 15, 1950, is the most personal of the 3. The film about consequences, about the long, slow costs of military service to domestic happiness, about whether fathers and sons and husbands and wives can find their way back to each other across years of separation and disappointment. The weakest of the 3 artistically, and most historians have said so honestly. But it is not a weak film. Ford's ensemble work is as strong as anywhere in the trilogy. The Wayne O'Hara pairing begins here, and it begins brilliantly, and Ben Johnson's horsemanship is at its most spectacular. Shot primarily in Moab in 32 days at approximately $1.2 million, the film earned $2.25 million in domestic rentals, and it earned Ford the right to make The Quiet Man, which won him his record 4th Oscar, and is now considered one of the greatest romantic comedies of the studio era. Sometimes the deal produces the greatest thing. Together, the 3 films earned approximately $8 million in combined domestic rentals in late 1940s dollars. Wayne reached the number 1 position at the box office in 1950 and 1951. Argosy Pictures established itself as a viable and prestigious independent production company. Monument Valley became permanently fixed in the global imagination as the visual symbol of the American West, and the most celebrated director-actor partnership in Hollywood history operated at its creative peak. All of this Ford would have called potboilers. History, as it turns out, has a way of correcting even the most informed self-assessments. When the legend becomes fact, we began by saying these were 3 films that changed the way America saw itself, built a landscape out of real rock and myth, and forged the most celebrated director-actor partnership in the history of Hollywood. After everything, the deal-making and the financial pressures, the production methods and technical choices, the performances that emerged from Ford's relentless instruction, the landscape and its sacred history, the Navajo community and its complicated relationship with Hollywood, the Cold War context, and the decades of critical reassessment, we arrive at the central paradox of the trilogy. Potboilers made for money, by a director who would never publicly admit to being proud of them, that have outlasted virtually everything else Hollywood produced in those 3 years. They have outlasted most of the prestige pictures, most of the literary adaptations, most of the films made with conscious artistic ambition, and the expectation of lasting critical recognition. The reason is that Ford, even while making what he considered commercial product, could not stop himself from caring about every frame, could not stop placing the horizon where it would be most beautiful. could not stop holding the shot until the last piece of action had resolved within it, could not stop bringing truth to material that did not necessarily demand it, could not stop looking at Monument Valley with the eyes of a man who genuinely loved what he saw, and transmitting that love through his camera so completely that audiences around the world have shared it for 75 years. The Cavalry Trilogy endures because it contains genuine art made by a genuine artist, even when that artist was the last person who would have called it that. Orson Welles said, "I prefer the old masters," by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford. John Ford stood up at a Directors Guild meeting in October of 1950, the same October when Rio Grande was in its final stages of preparation, and said, "My name's John Ford. I make westerns." That is the statement of a man who knew exactly where his genius lived, not in theory, not in prestige, not in the approval of critics. In light and landscape, and the sound of hoofbeats, and the face of John Wayne in the dying afternoon light of Monument Valley, carrying more dignity than dignity itself. Wayne kept a framed portrait of Ford, signed, dated 1947, the year they made Fort Apache, in his home until the day he died in 1979. And the last thing Ford said to him on his deathbed, in the summer of 1973, was, "All right, Duke, I think I'll rest for a while." Monument Valley still stands in the desert, exactly as it has stood for 160 million years. The Mitten Buttes rise above the valley floor, the red earth and the impossible sky. John Ford Point still faces west, still offering the view that Ford composed and recomposed 7 times across 25 years. 350,000 visitors a year come to stand where the cameras once stood, to look at a landscape through eyes that Ford's films have permanently shaped. The legend became fact, and then the fact became something larger than either legend or reality. It became a permanent part of what America imagines when it imagines itself. Free, wide open, a little dangerous, impossibly beautiful, worth the ride. That is what Three Pot Boilers, made for money by a one-eyed Irish-American director and a prop boy turned icon from Iowa, accomplished between 1948 and 1950 in the desert on the border of Utah and Arizona. Not bad for a day's work, Pappy. If you have watched this far, if you have come through the full story of Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon and Rio Grande, through Harry Goulding's $60 and his box of photographs, through Ford's poker games and Wayne's careful deliberate losing, through the thunderstorm over the Mitten Buttes and the dying light of a Remington painting brought to color life, through the story of 2 men whose friendship was a very fine manly love and who made 24 films together across 35 years, then you already know what this channel is about. It is about the films and the filmmakers that built the golden age of American cinema, about the stories behind the stories, about what it took, the talent and the stubbornness and the love of craft, and the willingness to go out into the desert and live in dirt floor cabins for 31 days because that was where the light was right, to make something that would outlast everyone involved in making it. Ford once said he made westerns. He said it plainly, at a meeting full of Hollywood's greatest names, and he said it like a man who knew exactly what he was and had made his peace with it. He was right, and he was also understating the case considerably, because making a western the way John Ford made a western, with that visual intelligence, that ensemble loyalty, that understanding of landscape and community and ritual and the specific quality of light in late afternoon in Monument Valley, was one of the most demanding and most beautiful things the cinema has ever produced. If you love classic westerns, if John Wayne on horseback against a Monument Valley sunset is what cinema means to you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that bell. We cover the golden age of Hollywood, the films that built America's mythology, and the men and women who made them. This is exactly where those stories live. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It helps more people who love classic cinema find their way here, and every one of those people deserves to know this story. Leave a comment below and tell us which of the 3 Cavalry Trilogy films is your favorite. Fort Apache and its moral complexity, the question of what we owe to the legends that hold us together. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon and its Remington palette, and Nathan Brittle's In the Dying Light, or Rio Grande and its portrait of a marriage tested by duty and time. Every answer is defensible. We read every comment. And to close, one last time, with the words of the greatest director who ever made a western, words he said simply at a meeting in front of all the biggest names in Hollywood, and meant every syllable. My name's John Ford. I make westerns. See you in the next one.